So, this class we're going to look at cascading style sheets. And these are really, really important. This is the difference really between old style web design and the modern way. Just give me a sec there, I'll just plug the machine into the power. Or if you cut out on us halfway. Sorry. So there was kind of an old way to do things and a new way, and often, whoops, sorry. Okay, and often you might see an example in an old book or on a website that's the wrong way. So it's a big deal to do this properly. So if in a lab I say to you, you know, oh well, that looks okay, or that looks fine, but it's wrong, it's probably because you haven't really done it in the right spirit. Okay, so the very, very, very first web pages were scientific papers. Do you know what CERN is? It's this place where they speed up these electrons and smash them into each other and whatnot. And the first web server was set up to make it more easy to distribute scientific research. And in that kind of a scenario, the logical structure of the document is important. So H1 tag, for example, heading 1, doesn't just tell you how that piece of text is going to look. If you have a H1 and a bunch of H2s and H3s under those, it tells you something about the structure of the document. There's meaning in there, you know? And that meaning is important. In very early days, web pages looked fairly bland. But, you know, an article on electrons smashing into each other, you know, how sexy was that going to be anyway? It was only when we started using web pages to sell things or to entertain people that designers wanted to have more control over how the pages would look. And so we started to get extensions to HTML. And there was a period when the browser manufacturers were falling over one another to come up with super cool new extensions. Okay? And the inclusion of these bells and whistles led to diminishing of the importance of the structure of the document. And the content of the page and the design of the page became intertwined. So there was a time when if you looked at the source of the HTML page, if you looked at the source of a document, you could hardly even read it, do you know what I mean? The content, because there was so much information about this should be in this color and this should be in this color and whatnot. So things went a bit mad. So of late, and you know, this isn't that recent, everybody should be doing it by now, we've been very strict with ourselves about separating the content of the page from the layout of the page. So your HTML document specifies the content of the page, and then typically we have somewhere else, usually even in a completely separate file, how it's going to look. So here's my wonderful essay on whatever, and then the information about, well, I want my heading 1s to be black and in this font, and I want my heading 2s to be this and whatever, and I want my, you know, images to have a nice yellow border around them, whatever. All of that is somewhere else. So the content in one page and the styling information in another is how we go about it. And so we're very strict on things like that. And also there are other tags and things that we don't use anymore, ever. The font tag being one of them, for example. Like if you were to use the font tag now for your project, I'd say you would just fail straight away. Do you know what I mean? You know, it's just like, if you're using the font tag, you're not even at the races really. Okay? You might say, well, it looks fine, it looks grand when I do in the browser. Yeah, but it's just not allowed. Now, so style sheets, as we call them, that's what we use to specify the layout of the page. They can be embedded in the HTML file for a page, or they can be separate. And storing the style sheet separately gives you lots of options, because it allows you to use the same style then for a bunch of pages. So if you had 100 pages on your website and you had the style embedded in the page, and then you discover, oh, we're actually changing our corporate identity. Our logo was purple, and so we had some purple text, but now we're going to red, so we're going to change that to red. You'd have to go in and change each page individually. But if you have the style information separate, then every page referencing that style will change as soon as the style sheet changes. So you just change the style sheet once, and all the pages that use it would change at the same time. So you could decide for a whole of December we're going to have, a Christmas color scheme, and you could just change the style sheet to Christmassy, and everything on the site would change. So that can be very efficient as well. It's also good practice just in terms of keeping the two things separate. You need to be almost religious about it. Content here, style here, and they should never interact with each other, only as far as is necessary. Okay, so if we look here up at the top, in the header of this document, we have link rel equals style sheet, href equals alpha.css, type equals text/css. So this says to the browser that the style for this web page is to be found at alpha.css. So there's a file called alpha.css that tells you how to style this page. So whatever the browser was going to do before, this overrides it. So by default, your browser probably has black text on a white background with your links in blue, your visited links in dark blue. The font is probably Times, and the H1 is probably huge, feck off, massive, ugly, typically. So if this style sheet says something about any of those things, they'll be overriding the default. Okay? In this HTML file here, we have a H1, and then we go straight to a H3. So I mean, there's an issue there, but that's not what we're looking at today. We're looking at how you would style those things. Okay? And you shouldn't put any style information inside in the HTML document itself. Now, so depending then on the style sheet, the page can look very different. So in these three examples here, we haven't changed the HTML at all, apart from saying we want to use a different style sheet. But the HTML document is otherwise unchanged, and you can see it can look very, very differently depending on what the style sheet says. And that's in here is what the style sheet might look like, but we'll look at all that in a while. Now, there are three different places you can put your style. There's inline styling, embedded styling, and linked styling. An inline style is where you style a particular tag or a particular element on a page. So here, the style equals font size 30, font weight bold. This styling information here applies only to that particular div. So they can be used in exceptional circumstances, but in general, they're considered bad practice. And if we use them all the time, you get none of the advantages of doing CSS. The whole point of CSS is that you can separate the style from the content, and that if you update the style in one place, it'll propagate across all of the places it's used. If you're putting your styles inline, you get none of the advantages. You might as well be doing things the old way. For your assignment, I cannot imagine a scenario in which an inline style would be acceptable. I just can't see it, you know. You would have to provide me with documentary evidence that someone had a gun to your head and told you if you didn't do it, they would shoot you, and that was like, you know, 30 seconds before the deadline and you didn't have time to change it. I cannot see any other scenario in which that would be okay. Yes, sir?
Once for another assignment, I was doing a website and just on one particular page I had a fixed navbar and I had to do margin 70 pixels or whatever it was just for one element, just to get it to align with whatever else was on the page. And I just logged it in on the actual HTML. If there was a scenario like that, you should make a...
I would say you should move heaven and earth and realign the stars so that they fit, rather than do that. If something on the page was forcing you to do that, you should go back and change everything else on the page. For this assignment, I think there's no scenario in which it would be okay. Now, an embedded style is a style that's a complete style sheet, but it's in the HTML document. Okay? So again, in the header, you could say, here's the style sheet for this page, and you could specify that. But they'll only apply then to this particular web page. So the disadvantage of these is that if you had 100 pages and you wanted to change from purple to red, well, then you'd have to go and do that 100 times. They're actually very useful for development. When you're coding up first, you'd have the HTML file and the style in the one document. So you could, you know, say, oh, that needs to be, that 18 doesn't look good there, we need that to be 20, you know, that color doesn't work there, I change the color, and they're all handy in the one spot. So you can use them for development, but then it does make sense once you're done to export it out into an external style sheet that you can apply across all of the pages of your site. So in that scenario, they're okay, but you do need to be careful as well. I have seen people do just that and develop the style in the page, and then they end up with in their CSS, when they put it in a single file, they actually end up with 5 separate style sheets for the 5 individual pages that it came from, rather than one style sheet to do, you know, all the pages. So you need to be careful that when you do put them into a single external style sheet, that in reality they're also one sheet and not 5 sheets stuck together, which is a problem people have. So the linked style then, the style sheet is a separate file and the browser goes away and gets that. And then several pages can access the same CSS file, and that can save you a lot of effort. So this is what you should be doing for your assignment. And also you should not only do it, but you should mean it. It really should be the one style sheet for all of the pages. Now the pages may have slightly different things, but the things they have in common should be the same for all of them. Okay. Now, there's a precedence at work then here, and this is where the cascade in cascading style sheets comes. So the browser has a default style sheet. So the person who, you know, wrote Chrome, the people who made Safari, the people who made Internet Explorer, the people who made Firefox, they said, look, this will be our default setting. So it's probably black on white, probably times various heights for the different H1s and H2s and whatnot. So that came with the browser by default. It's possible as a user to have a user style sheet. So this comes from a time when, let's say, you didn't see very well, or let's say you were dyslexic and you found that white on black worked better for you than black on white. So you could have said, okay, browser, I know you have your way of doing things, but I would actually prefer white on black instead of black on white. So you, as a user, could have had your own style sheet that overrode the default style sheet. Now, a linked style sheet would override the user style sheet. And if you think about it, it has to be this order. An embedded style sheet, which only applies to that particular page, that would override the linked style sheet. And the inline style would override the embedded style, which overrides the linked style, which overrides the user style, which overrides the default style. So if you have H1 and the default style says that should be black, and the user style says it should be green, well, the user style will win out. But if the linked style says it should be orange, it'll win out. If the embedded style on the page that applies to just that page, then if that says something different, well, that'll apply to just that page. And if you have actually attached to the H1 itself an inline style, well, then that would override all those. So that's where the cascade and cascading style sheets comes from. So if you do have conflicting style information, this is used to resolve that. You can also, in fact, say you want, if you look at this, a user style, which you might have gone to a lot of trouble to devise, might actually be no good because it's being overridden now, because everything would come with its own style sheet. You can actually even say to your browser, I want you to change the order and stuff, but that gets complicated. So this is important to know, but you're not going to use this or rely on this, because you're not going to have any inline nor any embedded styles. So it doesn't actually matter to you. Okay, so this is what CSS now actually looks like. So each CSS rule has a selector and a declaration. So the selector is the part where you say, okay, so this is what I'm talking about. So wherever you see a H1, for example, I want the color to be blue and I want the font weight to be bold. So that's what this is saying. So we have the selector part and the declaration part. Now all the other properties will be inherited. So if the H1s were going to be in times, like they'll still be in times. So any inherited properties stay where they are, but this will overwrite other properties. So it'll overwrite the properties. So if it was in black before, it's blue now. Okay, so you have a selector, the thing you're talking about, and then what it looks like. And that's the structure of your CSS file, your style sheet. So here, for example, we're saying wherever you have a H1, we want the color to be this 0000FF, which is blue. And then we say font family, Helvetica, Impact, or sans serif. We'll look at that in more detail later. H3, we want to be in whatever color. And wherever you have a P, we want the background to be that color, and we want the font family to be whatever. So we're styling H1s, H3s, and Ps. So wherever there's a H1, it should look like this. Wherever there's a H3, it should look like this. Wherever you have a P, it should look like this. Okay. Now, web pages can only be displayed in fonts that are actually installed on the machine. So if you love playing with fonts and you have super freaky font number 72 installed on your machine, well, that's good for you, but you can't expect everyone in the world to have super freaky font number 72 installed on their machine. So typically what you do is you list the fonts in order of preference. So you might say, well, if they have super freaky font number 72, yip-de-doo, use that. If they don't have that, well, then we might go for Helvetica. If they don't have that, might go for Impact. So it's a bit like voting in Ireland. You specify your number 1 choice, then your number 2 choice, your number 3 choice, your number 4 choice, and whatever. Then at the very, very end, you must specify a generic font collection. And that's not an option, that's a rule. You must do that. So you must specify generic font at the end. Okay? there are 5 generic font collections. There's serif, sans serif, or sans serif, depending on your side of the Atlantic, I suppose, monospace, fantasy, and cursive. So most browsers would have one representative of each of these families. So if we go back to the voting analogy, these are like political parties. So you might say, I'll have candidate number 1, candidate number 2, this, and then, you know, the sans serif party. So whoever your representative for sans serif is, that's who I'll have. Okay? So depending then on the browser that you have and the operating system that you have and whatnot, some fonts will be available, some won't. I suppose you want to have a common PC one, a common Mac OS one, a common Android one, a common iOS one if it's different from Mac OS, and then your generic font family after that. So for example, Helvetica would be available on a Mac, but maybe not on Windows. Impact might be the closest representative, the closest match for that. Now, to solve the problem of you not having all these super cool fonts installed on your device, Google has a project where if you want super cool font number 72, you can go to Google Fonts and it will give you a snippet of code that you can include in your page. And then when the page loads, it'll actually say to the browser, oh, you can download super cool font number 72 from Google and use that to display. And there are some freaky things there. Generally, you might want to use it if for your heading across the top or for your headlines you want something freaky. So if you were doing a Halloween theme for your website, you might want some really weird font for the H1s and the H2s or something. Okay, and you could go and get that freaky font from Google and use that. Generally, for the body of your text, for the plain vanilla part that you want people to read, you don't want weird and strange fonts there anyway. But if you do use the Google Fonts and it's supported by the browser, there's a good chance that anybody then will be able to see the page as you imagined it. But as I keep saying with HTML, you do your best to specify what it is you want, and then you let the browser do its thing. You can't expect to have total control over how it's going to look. But Google Fonts certainly gives you access to lots of interesting, fun fonts. If you wanted a freaky, fun font before, what you might have had to do was go into Photoshop or something and do your, Halloween news in the weird font, and then save that as an image and display it as an image on the page. But then you had the disadvantage, of course, that you couldn't read that. You could see it as a human, but a non-human couldn't do that. Couldn't see what was inside because it's just an image. And so that was bad for the likes of Google, because the heading of the page is very important for Google because it tells us a lot about, what the H1s and the H2s are. That's really useful information. So it's no great surprise that Google found a way for you to have super cool, freaky fonts on your page in a way that made you happy, but also worked for Google. It's a win-win situation. So you can look into Google Fonts. We're not going to do anything with that. Now, we can't possibly cover every single thing in CSS, but we have all these selectors, the thing you want to talk about, and then the declaration says what you want to change. And you have a property and you have a value. So we have the color property and we want its value to be blue. We have the font weight property, we want its value to be bold. So there are a whole bunch of properties, and different things can have different properties. Some properties will only apply to certain things. Okay. Now, when you're talking about sizes in CSS, there are a bunch of different measurements you can use. This allows you, for example, to make maybe a kind of a print view where you want something to be a certain number of inches or a certain number of centimeters. On the screen, those absolute values don't mean a whole lot. Okay? Pixels does mean a lot. Okay? So you can specify, for example, you want the height of your cells of your table to be 50 pixels tall or something, or 100 pixels wide. You might know, for example, that you're designing your page to work around, you know, a width of 800 pixels on your screen. So you might decide you want one part to be 200 pixels, the next part to be 400 pixels, the next part to be 200 pixels or something. You might go that way. As a general rule, though, if it's practical, relative values are better. So if you're splitting your page up into 3 sections, for example, well, maybe it's better if the first part isn't 200 pixels, but is 25%. It's better if the middle part isn't 400 pixels, but 50%. And better that the other part isn't the remaining 200 pixels, but the remaining 25%. So you can be fixed or relative. We generally consider relative to be better. We also have, when we're talking about fonts, we have relative heights. Okay? So an M is the height of an uppercase letter M. We chose that because that's the full height of a character. Okay? And then an X is the height of, you know, a regular character. And what you'd call that? But it's the, you know, that height there. Okay, so when you're looking at a font, you have those 2 heights. So if I wanted my H1s to be twice the height of my regular text, I might know that my regular text is going to be 10 pixels high. So I could say I want my H1s to be 20 pixels high. But it's better to say I want my H1s to be twice the size of my regular text. Because then if the regular text changes size, so will the text that's twice the size will change in proportion. So wherever possible, you want to go with relative values rather than fixed values, absolute values. Okay? So we'll just look at some properties here. You can look them all up, okay? So the font style property tells you whether it's italics or not. So that can be set to normal, it can be set to italic, and it can be set to oblique. In my experience, most browsers don't actually support oblique. So you end up with italics. There is a difference between italics and oblique. You can find a typographer to explain to you the difference. I think oblique is just regular text slanty, and italic is actually more than that, but I'm not sure. The font weight property tells you how bold it is. So we're used to just regular and bold, but you can have like super bold, which is bolder, lighter. You can even give it a value. Again, support for the value, you know, is limited. CSS is very kind of future-proof, and we're not quite at the future yet, but it was designed in a way that would allow you at least to specify what you would like, even if the browsers haven't quite caught up with that yet. Font variant, for example, is normal or small caps. I think we have an example of that way back here. Here, the font variant for the P. Oh no, that's not. Okay, that wasn't it actually. Sorry. deliberately wasting your time. You can have normal, or you can have small caps. So you could have the lowercase characters appear in capital letters but smaller. And you don't have to go and change the text, you just change the style and then it does that for you. Now, this is important. It's possible to have a specification or a declaration for a font using this shorthand notation here, where you don't have to specify every single property followed by the value. You can just say font, and then you can specify it this way. So the first up, you must have font weight, font style, and font variant in any order that you like. Then followed by the font size, and then the font family must come at the end. And as before, you must end with a generic font collection. Okay? But it does mean you don't have to go property value, property value, property value, property value. You can save a bit of time. A bunch of different text ones here. We're not going to go through them all. The vertical align property, for example, would make something, you know, superscript or subscript. No. This is where now it starts to get a bit tricky. Okay? So you can have contextual selectors. We have a selector inside a selector. So the first piece here says wherever you have a B, wherever you have a bold, I want the color to be blue. The next one then is more restrictive. So this is saying if you have a B tag that's inside in a P tag, then I want it to be red. So it'll only apply to B's that are inside P's. And this one here is saying if you have a B that's inside a P that's inside a span, then it'll apply. So a good example of where you might be interested in that is, let's say you might want to say wherever I have a link that's inside in a list item, I want it to look like this. You might want them to look differently if they're part of a list, for example. No. This here is something you probably won't use, but it can get you out of a pickle sometimes. This is saying wherever you have a B that's inside a P and only one level below it, I want you to do this. Okay? So it's not enough that, if you imagine the tree, it's not enough that the B is somewhere inside in the P. It must be the level directly under it. So it's not enough that it's a mere descendant. It must be a, first generation, must be a child. Now, we'll also end up using then classes and IDs. But ideally, we would like to use as few of these as possible. Okay? So a class can be added to the tag of a HTML document. And then you can use a style sheet to target all of the elements that have that class, or indeed all of the particular tags that have that class, if you want to go that way. And we will end up doing a bit of that in order to lay out the page. So unfortunately, that increases the link between the HTML and the CSS. They're more tightly coupled as a result of that, unfortunately. But to do the things we want to do, we can't avoid using classes. So here we're saying h1 class equals important. We have a div, and then we also have div class equals important. No. So we're saying wherever we have a div, we want it to be sans serif. No, it turns out they're all sans serif anyway. And then if we say dot important, font weight bold, color red, we're saying all the tags, all the things that have the class important, this applies to them. So it applies to both that H1, my lovely page, and also that div in a land far, far away. Here we have div dot important. So in this case, it only applies to the divs that are important. Okay? And then there's one last thing, which is an ID. As it turned out, we saw IDs when we're talking about JavaScript. They're the same IDs. So an ID is used to identify one element on a page, and the IDs must be unique. Okay? And so here we have a div with the ID start, and if we say hash start, then that selector is selecting that ID. In general, I think IDs should be avoided. When you're doing stuff in JavaScript, you typically have no choice. But for your web page assignment, no, actually we can't really avoid using IDs either. Okay, where we're going to do things, no. But they're not great. The important thing is to not go mad. So we have at our disposal selectors, and we have contextual selectors. They can be quite sophisticated, so you can specify a lot. So for example, if you want to do something, but it only applies to links that are inside in a list, that are inside in a table, well, you can say that. You can say if it's a list, if it's a link inside a list inside a table, do that. So you should be slow to resort to classes and IDs. Because if you have too many classes and IDs, you start to lose all the advantages that CSS gives you. So if you go mad with the classes and IDs, you start to go backwards. And you end up not quite as bad as you were before. But every time you introduce a class or an ID, you're losing some of the advantages of your CSS. Okay. So let's see some of this at work. So quite some time ago now, it seems, I asked you to do up your timetable in HTML. And if we look here at this timetable that I've made, I've specified this style sheet here. And we have TRs, THs, and TDs. It's just a table. And if we look here at the CSS, we're saying here, for example, wherever you have a caption, we want the color, the background color to be this, and the color of the text to be this. So if I was to, if we look at this now, it's that color. If I was to change this to 00, that would go to green. Sorry, save. Okay, that's kind of disappointing. Maybe it's not going to work for me. Well, it's clearly not working for me. I'm sure I'm using the right style sheet. Okay, something going on there. We'll go through it anyway, okay?
Background hyphen color.
Hmm?
I've only ever seen it as a background hyphen color. Can it just be background?
Sorry?
The tag background,
Yeah.
or it should be background hyphen color.
Maybe it should. But I've used it elsewhere, haven't I? No, because I actually changed it a minute ago, so I don't know what's going on. Anyway, for the TDs here, we're saying we want the background color to be whatever, the text color to be black. And you notice that I've said border 1 pixel, solid, and blue. So that's how we get this, this border here around the TD cells. What's useful in this table is that when this table was coded, we went to the trouble of having separate TDs and THs, so that they can be styled very differently. In the default setting, they don't look a whole lot different. Interestingly, for the empty cells, there's this property here. You can give it a value hide, and what that does is, if there's a cell with nothing in it, it displays it like this. And you see there's no background color there, for example. So it makes it easier to read. You can also specify where you want the caption to go. So I put it here at the bottom. If the browser supports that, it'll go at the bottom. If it doesn't, it might go somewhere else. You can put it left and right as well. So there are all these various properties. Padding is the space around the text and the cell wall. I would change that and show you it, but this clearly isn't working. We've already established it doesn't work. So there's very little point in my trying to show you. Oh, no, that does work. Okay. So we'll reduce the padding a bit. Let me see if I can increase the size of the border on the THs, for example. Save. And so I'm just changing the style sheet here. I'm not changing the HTML document itself. Okay, now it works. Don't know why. I did it differently. Maybe there's an issue with the cache or something. Okay. So what I would like you to do now is I would like you to take the timetable that you did and style it. The way to do that is to include this line here. Link rel equals style sheet, href equals the name of your style sheet, and then type equals text/CSS. And you must save then in the same folder a style sheet using the extension .css. And I leave this up so you can have a look at the different properties you might want to select. At a later stage, I will explain to you why, for example, 000066 is a dark blue. But I won't do that today. It would be lovely as an exercise to get you to write a new style sheet for the timetable system. But if you look at the source sent to the browser from the timetable system, it's a very good example of the wrong way to do something. And you wouldn't believe if you look at the HTML for your timetable, you would find it hard to actually read it. Whereas the one you're going to design, if you weren't able to render the HTML file in a browser, even if you just saw the source, you could probably figure out where you're supposed to go. If you look at the source sent to you by the CAT timetabling system, you just go, oh my God. Okay. So any questions on that? So the style sheet is a separate file, external to the HTML file, separate file altogether, and you have selector and rule or style. What do we say? Each rule has a selector and what's the proper term? Don't all shout at once. Declaration. So wherever you have a caption, note the curly brackets there, you do this. Note also the semicolon here. Wherever you have a TD selector, this is what you do. Okay, so you can look up then for fonts, for example, you can look up the different kinds of fonts. You can look up the different font properties. You know, so like font variant, small caps, for example. Oh yeah, do we see an example of small caps here? We do look. So here the THs are small caps. If you look at the HTML itself, they're just regular ONDAY, but in the rendered version, it's up small caps. So it's uppercase letters, small. That's as a result of font variant, small caps. So you don't need to know all the things off the top of your head, but you need to know how to apply them properly. And do we have a font tag? No, we haven't used the shorthand font at all here. So you can say font, and then you can specify the different things, and then the size, and then the font family. Haven't done that here. We've gone straight for just the font family property and values. Any questions? Okay, so flake away in that so, and I leave this up on the screen.